Hi, I'm Les Brown, and welcome back to So You Want to Write a Novel. It's been a few weeks since our last episode, and I appreciate your sticking with me. I've been deep in the weeds building a new tool for writers that I can't wait to show you, but that's for a future episode. Today I want to talk about something I love, dialogue. When I started writing my first novel, The Priest, I thought dialogue was going to be the easy part. People talk. I've listened to people talk my whole life. How hard could it be to put words in a character's mouth? Turns out it's one of the trickier things in fiction, and also one of the most rewarding to get right. So let me share what I've figured out over 4 novels, close to 5, and almost 400,000 words. The first thing I learned, and it took me a while, is that good dialogue is never just two people talking. Every exchange in your novel needs to be earning its keep. It needs to be doing at least one of 3 things, and ideally 2 or 3 at once. Advancing the plot, revealing the character, or building tension. Let me show you what I mean. There's a scene early in The Priest where Jeff tells Paul he's leaving the seminary. On the surface, it's 2 friends having a difficult conversation, but underneath it's doing 3 things at once. Jeff says, "I need to tell you something important, and I wanted you to hear it from me. I'm not coming back next year." That's plot. A major story event delivered through dialogue, not narration. Paul says, "You've always seemed happy here, and you've only got a year to go." That tells us about Paul. He sees what he wants to see. He assumes everyone's experience mirrors his own. And then Paul says, "If it's because of me, I'm so sorry." And Jeff says, "No." And then a beat later, "Well, it has almost nothing to do with you." That little correction, the shift from no to almost nothing, does all 3 jobs in 5 words. It advances the story, it reveals Jeff's honesty, and it ratchets up the tension because now we know there's something unresolved between them. I didn't plan that moment. It came out of knowing the characters well enough that they surprised me. Early on, I leaned heavily on dialogue tags. We've talked about those. He said, she said, he replied, she asked. They're not wrong. Said is practically invisible to the reader, and that's fine. But what I discovered over time is that I could replace a lot of my tags with action beats, small physical actions that tell you who's speaking and show you something about how they're feeling all at once. Here's an example from The Priest. Instead of writing, "So I see. What's the hurry?" Jared said, I wrote, "Jared could see beyond Jeff into the chaos that had once been a neat and tidy room. So I see. What's the hurry?" The action beat, Jared scanning the messy room, tells you he's speaking, and it also tells you he's observant, maybe a little judgmental. You get character and attribution in one stroke. I still use said and asked. They have their place. But I found that the more I replaced tags with beats, the more alive my scenes became. The characters weren't just voices floating in space. They were people in a room doing things with their hands and their eyes while they talked. This is the one I'm most proud of figuring out, and it's become one of my favorite tools. In any dialogue scene, there are really two conversations happening. The one that's spoken out loud and the one that's going on inside the character's head. When you layer those together, you get subtext. And subtext is where dialogue comes alive. There's a moment in The Priest that I think captures this very well. Jeff asks Jared, "Have you seen Paul this morning?" And Jared's internal thought is, "Not since he left my room." But what he says is, "No." But knowing him, he's probably in the chapel already. The reader gets both conversations at once. They know Jared is hiding something. They know the surface pleasantry is performance. And the tension comes not from what's said, but from the gap between what's said and what's thought. I learned that some of the most powerful dialogue in my novels is the dialogue that isn't spoken. I used this technique a lot in The Monk. Jeff is the point of view character for much of the book, and he's got opinions about everything. When Paul tells him, "Jared would love to see you," Jeff's internal response is, "Well, that wasn't true." When Paul invites him to move in, Jeff thinks, "Oh, twist my arm." But what he says out loud is cautious. What if Jared doesn't go for the idea? And then to himself, "And he won't." That running internal commentary lets the reader in on a secret. They become Jeff's confidant, seeing through the polite surface to what's really going on. It's one of the most intimate things you can do with dialogue, and it's something I stumbled into more than planned. Once I saw how well it worked, I leaned into it hard. Related to that, and this is something I discovered writing The Bishop, some of the best dialogue is when a character refuses to engage with what's being said. Deflection, avoidance, changing the subject. In real life, people do this all the time. And when your characters do it, it tells the reader volumes about who they are. The Bishop is told in first person by Sean, a 75-year-old bishop who's been summoned to Rome and is terrified about what that means. He's at dinner with his old friend Luho, a powerful cardinal, pouring out his fears about a political enemy in the Vatican. And Sean says, "Don't you find it more than a little coincidental that just after you get dismissed from your position, he calls me to Rome?" He's desperate for answers. And Luho's response is, what I think is that Alessandro is every bit as fine a cook as his father, and that you worry too much. What would you like for dessert? That one line tells you everything about Luho, his power, his ease, his refusal to be drawn into panic. And it tells you everything about the dynamic between these two men. Sean is anxious and exposed. Luho is in control and deflecting with charm. I didn't need to describe that dynamic. The dialogue showed it. One of the hardest things about dialogue, and I'm still working on this, is making sure your characters don't all sound like you. Each person has their own rhythm, their own vocabulary, their own way of dodging a question or making a point. In The Acolyte, Randy's a teenager. When he's upset, he doesn't give speeches. He says things like, "Can we talk about this later? I just want to calm down." That's a kid talking, short, direct, emotionally overwhelmed. His priest, Father Sean, speaks differently, more measured, more carefully. Would it be okay if I talk to Randy in private for a few minutes? That's a man who's conscious of boundaries and authority. And then in the bishop, Lujo is Italian, so his English has a particular flavor. He calls Sean caro mio, and he gives a typically Italian palms up shrug. Those little touches of language and gesture aren't decoration, they're characterization. When Lujo speaks, you can hear the accent, the warmth, the European ease. He sounds nothing like Randy, nothing like Jared, nothing like Jeff. And that was always my goal. If you covered the dialogue tags, you should still be able to tell who's speaking. I won't pretend I always hit that mark, but it's what I aim for. And the more I wrote, the more distinct my characters' voices became. It's something that develops with practice more than technique. Dialogue is one of those things that I think you get better at by writing a lot of it and by listening to how people actually talk, how they interrupt each other, how they avoid saying what they mean. Real people don't speak in perfectly formed paragraphs. They hesitate, they circle back, they say one thing and mean another. The closer your dialogue gets to that messy human reality, the more alive it feels on the page. Everything I've shared today came from writing 5 novels and making a lot of mistakes along the way. I didn't sit down with a checklist of dialogue techniques. I just kept writing, kept listening to my characters, and paid attention when something worked. If any of this resonates with you, I'd encourage you to trust that process. As always, thanks for listening, and keep writing.